again. I'm Dean Brown, and we're raising questions. Boy, we're raising a lot of questions this time. This is just a day after Bernie Sanders took the lead in the New Hampshire primary. He won the New Hampshire primary. And it was really interesting to see Pete Buttigieg, the ex-mayor of South Bend, Indiana, where I'm actually from, where I grew up, come on TV shortly after the polls closed, and he acknowledged that Bernie Sanders had won, but he didn't say so. He just said, I want to congratulate Senator Sanders on his strong showing. And now I don't know whether that indicates a streak of nastiness or not in Mayor Pete, but it does indicate, it does show that those two are not going to be real friendly to each other in the near future somehow. And we have to wonder to whom they are going to be friendly. And I think one of the questions that brings up, in other words, is who's going to be nominated for vice president? Obviously, it won't be Joe Biden, but Sanders, if he takes the nomination, is going to have to find somebody who's able to broadcast something of an image that's more down the center of American politics. And that could be Amy Klobuchar, who knows? She could be angling, actually, to become the vice president, and she would be a really very serious person to have in the White House as a counterweight in the eyes of the public to a President Sanders. Pete, on the other hand, is just plain too young. That's all there is to it. What is he, 38, something like that? He doesn't know a thing about the life that most people go through by the time they're 40, 50, 60, 70, or whatever. And guess what? A lot of people are indeed older than 38 years old. And he's probably got a lot of very good ideas about how to solve some of the country's problems, but he can only look at a very narrow swath of life and identify with it, whereas a lot of people he just really knows very, very little about on the basis of personal experience. And I think that does make a difference. Whereas Senator Sanders is almost 80 years old, he's got a lot of experience, he knows what people go through during various stages of life, and I think that might be really, very important. And if Sanders gets into the White House, it might be nice to have somebody else who also knows something about that kind of stuff. Amy Klobuchar is not as old as Sanders, but at least she's older than Mayor Pete, and I think she'd be a good balance. Now, that raises other questions, though. Can Senator Sanders or any other Democrat beat Mr. Trump? I'm very depressed about the whole thing. Trump is a genius. There's no question about it. Look what he's done in life. He has succeeded in this very, very American way, becoming incredibly rich as a businessman, at least on paper. And then he decided, well, I think I'll be president of the United States. And for 8 years, he probably will have been president of the United States. He's now appealing to the black population that Senator Biden and ex-Vice President Biden was trying to appeal to. And he's got a narrow chance still of doing that, but it doesn't look like he's strong enough really to do that and get the nomination. President Trump, on the other hand, is already in power, and he can direct any kind of commercial that he wants towards any kind of group, and he's doing, allegedly, a pretty good job of appealing to the black community. And he's appealing, therefore, to part of the Democratic base that the Democrats really, really need. And if he continues doing that kind of thing, appealing not only to his base, I'm talking about Trump, if he appeals not only to his base, but also picks up 5, 10, 15% of the Democratic community, then the Democrats are really in trouble. And something just tells me that in these times, what the country wants, and we see this happening in other parts of the world too, what this country wants is a so-called strong man. That's why so many millions of Christians, let's say, have forgiven Trump for his sins or alleged sins, and they're secretly grateful for the mere fact that he is a strong guy, and he's ruling like a strong man. And some major networks, or at least one that I can think of, are on top of him for that, constantly criticizing him for that. And the moment that they get through with doing that, criticizing him for something, he does something else that a strong man would do. He's not listening. Strong men don't listen to their critics who sit around in television studios acting sophisticated and telling the strong men what they should and should not be doing. Same thing for the House of Representatives and the Senate, both of whom, in my opinion, and in a couple of constitutional law professors who showed up for the hearings, in their opinion too, the House and Senate both overstepped their bounds, especially the House. Actually, the Senate did not overstep its bounds in the same direction that the House did. The Senate very wisely said, no, we're not going to toss the president out. The House had said, you've got to toss him out without a proper proceedings, in my opinion. And as a result of the whole carnival of the impeachment and the failed trial of the impeached president, as a result of all that carnival, President Trump is probably stronger. And if you look at the Constitution, unfortunately, he should have won, at least in my opinion. If you go back to what the Founding Fathers started, and this is maybe the most depressing thing of all, the Founding Fathers, after all, and they were fathers, not just founders. At that time, there were founding fathers, and that's an important part of the issue here. The Founding Fathers started a constitution, wrote a constitution, wrote a basis for a new kind of country, but what they did was fuse an administrator on one hand with a king on the other hand, and they created a presidency. And they gave that presidency to the strongest guy around at the time, George Washington, and everybody trusted him. And they set up an electoral college that could continue to support and install people in the White House whom the electoral college felt would do the best job. And let's take a look at that. These details are not all boring. The Electoral College is founded on the idea that each state should have a role in producing a job for a new president. In other words, each state should have the right to say who's going to be the president, not the people. And nowadays we look at that and we say, well, that's not democratic. But that's not the point. Again, that's not the point. This country is, it consists of 50 different units, and a lot of them differ a lot from a lot of the others. There's the South, there's the North, there's the Northeast, the Northwest, there's California, a case all by itself. How are you going to keep those units together? Well, by doing things that are not democratic. You can't just hand over power to the people in this country and ignore the fact that all the people live in different states with very strong state laws and very strong interests in what the national laws are, as propagated by the Congress and the President and then approved by the Supreme Court. So all of that is just to say that we are in a federal system and not in a democracy. That's how it started, and that's how it continues. Just as an example, in the original Constitution, there were 4 branches of the government set up: the House of Representatives, the Senate, the Presidency, and the Supreme Court. How many were elected in the original Constitution, the Constitution we still have without amendments? How many of those 4 branches were elected by the people? Answer: 1. The House of Representatives, which was given limited power, and all of its powers were checkable by the Senate, and the Senate was chosen by, guess who? The states. State governments chose their 2 senators. And we also know, obviously, it's obvious to everyone, that the Electoral College that chose the president, that's the 3rd branch that I'm talking about, the Electoral College that chose the president was not directly elected, and the Supreme Court can't be elected. It's a bunch of allegedly objective judges above voting patterns. So we had 4 parts of the government in the original Constitution without amendments: the House, the Senate, and the presidency and the Supreme Court. Only one, just the House, was directly elected. And that has changed since then, in that now the senators are directly elected. But behind that, you still have this philosophy that the states have a tremendous role to play in Washington. So each state, including tiny Vermont, sends as many senators as gigantic California, as a matter of fact. All right, so what does that have to do with being depressed about the current state of affairs? The country is divided into 50 different states, into 50 different groups of people. It's very, very hard to get the place united. And as a result of that, the president becomes the focus of the national government. He or she, up to now just he, has a very strong role to play, not just suggesting legislation and approving legislation, but also being, as I started out saying, something of a king, a strong man. When in 1776, when we had our revolution and all that, we tossed out a particular king and we tossed out kingship, as a matter of fact. Let's get rid of the king. Well, the human mind, the human psyche, has a certain spot in it that just loves the king. Everybody who's 2 years old and gets read fairy tales learns very quickly that back in the old country, a long, long time ago, there was a king, a good king, a bad king. And magically enough, you know when you're 2 or 3 years old what a king is. Nobody really has to explain it to you. They might say, whoever's reading the story might say, well, the king told everybody what to do. Oh, okay. That is part of the human psyche. And so, here's the point finally, or here's a point finally. A Mr. Trump comes along and plays that role beautifully, absolutely sensationally, that role he plays of a king. Some people will say he plays the good king, some will say he plays the bad king, somebody says he's kind of in the middle. But one way or another, he is playing king. And one very strong question, one very big question is, did yesterday's primary in New Hampshire produce somebody who might look like and act like a king to rival the kingship that Mr. Trump has established? Boy, that is a question. Let's go back to my anti-youth tirade that I started out with. I'm not saying Buttigieg is entirely incompetent or unqualified just because of his age, but he doesn't radiate kingship. Jack Kennedy did at just about the same age. He had enough of that king about him, or Prince Charming at the very least, and his wife, the Queen, Jackie. They fit into that picture that I'm talking about, that psychological picture. Mr. and Mr. Buttigieg do not. That is not going to work. Buttigieg cannot be the king, and not just because he's gay. I'm not saying that. He is not the type. Amy, maybe she could play the royal role. Who knows? Whether Mr. Sanders, Senator Sanders, can do it is really up in the air. About the best thing he could do probably is to be another General Eisenhower. Eisenhower took over in 1952. He looked and acted a little bit on the old side, and he'd been a military hero. So he was able to step in as General Eisenhower. He dropped the general part, of course, and took over and ruled effectively with the Congress and the House for 8 years. And since then, we've had maybe one other guy who played the role of king really, really well, and that was Lyndon Johnson. He got us Medicare, he got us the Civil Rights Act, he also got us, of course, the misery of the Vietnam War, or at least he continued the misery of the Vietnam War, which shows you the king, a guy who plays the king really well, can do good things and bad things. So right now, I'm just saying it's very, very perplexing. We don't know what the primary, the Democratic primary, has produced. We know, though, that, or at least I think I believe, and I think I know, that what we need is a Democrat king, or a Democrat who can play the role of king to counter effectively Mr. Trump. And this raises all kinds of other issues. I'm not saying that Mr. Trump does everything wrong. I am saying, though, that if you're a Democrat, and I guess I still feel that I am, if you're a Democrat, you kind of almost wish that Trump were a Democrat. All right, till next time.